Calvin Voss pressed his back against the icy metal wall, his breath loud and ragged in the silence. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in this sterile labyrinth, not in this ridiculous paper-thin hospital gown. And certainly not helping a janitor named Lenny wheel a mop cart filled with stolen lab supplies and a banged-up laptop that allegedly held the keys to his freedom. Are you sure this is gonna work? Calvin hissed, his voice barely audible. Lenny paused mid-stride, casting a nervous glance down the pristine white corridor. His mop handle clinked against the cart as he adjusted the oversized military badge pinned awkwardly to his jumpsuit. Work? Sure. Maybe. I mean, you're the one who's bulletproof, right? Bulletproof isn't the same as invincible, Calvin shot back. And it definitely doesn't mean I'm okay with getting shot. Well, that's the beauty of it, Lenny said, pulling out a crumpled packet of gum and popping a piece into his mouth. If this plan goes sideways, I'll be the one catching the bullets. They won't even see you in the cart. Calvin glared at him. You stuffed me in the cleaning cart like I'm laundry. What part of this says, bulletproof plan, to you? Relax, big guy, Lenny said, patting the side of the cart. It's genius. Nobody notices the janitor. I've been hauling biohazard waste down this hallway for 3 years, and not one guard's ever checked inside my mop bucket. Calvin gritted his teeth. He'd only known Lenny for a grand total of 10 minutes, but in that time, he'd learned 2 things. Lenny was clearly unqualified for whatever black market lab assistant gig he had going, and Calvin's options for escape were depressingly limited. The plan, if it could even be called that, was simple. Lenny had bribed a low-level tech in the security room to disable the cameras for 5 minutes. In that window, they'd wheel Calvin out of the research wing and into the loading dock. From there, Calvin was supposed to make a break for it. Simple. Foolproof. Except for the glaring fact that Calvin had no idea how to operate in the world outside these walls. He'd spent every moment of his adult life inside this facility. They'd kept him here, poked and prodded him, watched him like a lab rat as his body transformed into something they couldn't control. Now they wanted him dead, or worse, back in the tank. The sound of footsteps echoed from around the corner, and Lenny froze. His hand shot to the cart, shoving it harder into the wall to hide Calvin's bulk behind the shadows. A pair of guards strolled past, their boots clicking sharply against the floor. They were armed, their rifles slung low but ready. Calvin tensed. The strange, alien instincts woven into his DNA flared to life, urging him to fight, to eliminate the threat, but he stayed put. He wasn't a monster. Not yet. The guards rounded the corner. Lenny let out a long, slow exhale. See? Easy as pie, he whispered, flashing Calvin a grin. Calvin rolled his eyes. Let's just keep moving. Lenny wheeled the cart forward, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. They made it 3 more hallways before the inevitable happened. A shrill alarm erupted overhead, accompanied by flashing red lights. Calvin bolted upright, knocking over the cart in a screech of metal. What did you do? I didn't do anything. Lenny yelled, clutching his mop like a weapon. It wasn't me. Before Calvin could respond, the far wall of the corridor exploded inward. Shards of reinforced glass and steel flew in every direction, and a hulking figure stepped through the rubble. Calvin's stomach dropped. He recognized the man immediately. Forge was one of the others, another experiment from Project Genesis. He was massive, his body encased in layers of adaptive armor that rippled and shifted with every step he took. His face was obscured by a helmet, but Calvin could feel his cold, mechanical gaze locked onto him. Calvin Voss, Forge's voice boomed, distorted through a speaker. Surrender now. Calvin didn't respond. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway was a dead end, and Forge was blocking the only exit. Last chance, Forge said, raising a fist that morphed into a cannon-like weapon. Come quietly, or I'll bring you back in pieces. Lenny, ever the opportunist, raised his mop like a white flag. Look, I'm just the janitor, Forge fired. A concussive blast shattered the cart, sending Lenny sprawling. Calvin barely had time to react before Forge lunged at him, swinging a massive armored fist. Calvin ducked, his body moving faster than his mind could process. His skin hardened instinctively, the familiar titanium-like sheen spreading over his arms. Forge's fist glanced off Calvin's shoulder, denting the wall behind him. Calvin countered with a wild swing of his own, landing a blow that sent Forge staggering back. "You've evolved," Forge said, almost approvingly. "Good. That'll make this interesting." Calvin didn't wait for him to recover. He charged, slamming into Forge with all his strength. The impact reverberated through the corridor, but Forge barely flinched. His adaptive armor absorbed the force, shifting like liquid to redistribute the energy. "Cute trick," Forge said, grabbing Calvin by the throat. "Let me show you mine." The armor around Forge's hands expanded, encasing Calvin's neck in a crushing grip. Calvin gasped, clawing at the unyielding metal. His vision blurred, the edges tinged with red, then something inside him snapped. A surge of energy rippled through his body, and Calvin felt his muscles swell, his skin harden further. He roared, shoving Forge back with a burst of strength that sent the larger man crashing through the opposite wall. Calvin staggered to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't know what had just happened, but there was no time to dwell on it. The alarms were still blaring, and more guards were surely on their way. Lenny groaned from the floor, clutching his side. "Okay, maybe this wasn't my best plan." "You think?" Calvin snapped, hauling Lenny to his feet. "Come on. We need to move." Together, they stumbled through the shattered remains of the corridor, dodging debris and sparks. Calvin's mind raced. Forge wouldn't stay down for long, and if he'd been sent, then the others couldn't be far behind. They reached the loading dock just as a squad of armed guards stormed in from the opposite side. Calvin shoved Lenny behind a stack of crates and stepped forward, his hands raised. "Stay back," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't want to hurt you." The guards hesitated, their weapons trained on him. For a moment, it seemed like they might listen, then Forge emerged from the corridor, his armor dented but still intact. "Don't waste your time talking," he said, striding toward Calvin. "They don't care. They're just following orders." Calvin clenched his fists. The strange energy inside him stirred again, a volatile mix of power and rage. He couldn't control it, couldn't predict what it would do, but he didn't have a choice. As the guards opened fire, Calvin's body reacted on its own. His skin hardened further, deflecting the bullets harmlessly. He charged forward, his movements a blur, and the guards scattered like leaves in the wind. Forge met him head-on, their clash shaking the entire room. Calvin fought with everything he had, his strikes growing more precise, more deliberate with each passing second. He could feel himself adapting, learning, evolving. Finally, with one last desperate push, Calvin sent Forge flying into the side of a transport truck. The impact crumpled the vehicle like a tin can, and Forge slumped to the ground, motionless. Calvin didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. He grabbed Lenny and bolted for the nearest exit, his heart pounding in his chest. The night air hit him like a wave, cool and sharp against his skin. For the first time in years, he was free, but he knew it wouldn't last. Calvin ran, his feet pounding against the cracked asphalt of the service road that snaked away from the facility. Behind him, alarms blared, but no voices followed. At least not yet. Lenny stumbled along beside him, clutching his ribs, his face pale in the faint glow of the moonlight. "Tell me there's a car," Calvin said between breaths. Yeah, Lenny wheezed, pointing ahead to a dark shape parked near a cluster of scrubby bushes. "Beat-up van. Real low profile. Not exactly James Bond, but it's got 4 wheels." Calvin shot him a look but kept moving. He didn't care if it was a tricycle as long as it got them far away from here. The van was ancient, rust crawling up the sides like ivy, but the keys were in the ignition as promised. Lenny collapsed into the passenger seat while Calvin slid behind the wheel, his hands trembling as he gripped it. "Do you even know how to drive?" Lenny asked, his voice strained. "I'll figure it out," Calvin snapped. He turned the key, and the van sputtered to life with a shuddering groan. Slamming it into gear, he pressed the accelerator, and they lurched forward onto the narrow road. The rearview mirror gave him a glimpse of the facility's looming shadow growing smaller behind them, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Lenny let out a low whistle. "Well, you pulled that off." "Kind of. Though Forge might not be dead, you know. Those guys don't just quit." "I know," Calvin said, his voice grim. His knuckles whitened on the wheel. "That's what worries me." For a while, the only sound was the rumble of the van's engine and the occasional groan from Lenny as he shifted in his seat. Calvin drove aimlessly, letting the van take them farther into the desert, away from the facility and its endless maze of sterile corridors. The adrenaline that had kept him sharp and moving was starting to ebb, leaving him feeling hollow and raw. Finally, Lenny broke the silence. "So, what's the plan, big guy?" Calvin didn't answer right away. He didn't have an answer. The world outside the lab was a mystery to him, a blur of images and ideas he'd glimpsed through brief windows of television in the rec rooms or overheard in guarded conversations between scientists. Freedom was a vague concept, something abstract and distant. Now that he had it, he wasn't sure what to do with it. "I need to find someone," he said eventually, his voice rough. "Dr. Gray. Do you know her?" Lenny's brow furrowed. "The rogue scientist lady?" "Yeah, I've heard of her. Word is she went off the grid years ago after leaking classified info about Project Genesis. Military's got a price on her head so high it'd make your nose bleed. Do you know where she is?" Lenny gave him a sidelong glance. "Why, you think she's gonna fix you or something? Like, wave a magic wand and turn you into a regular guy again?" Calvin didn't reply, but the set of his jaw was answer enough. "Look," Lenny said, "I don't know where she is, but I've got contacts. People who know things. If anyone can track her down, it's them." "Then we'll find them," Calvin said simply. He wasn't sure why he trusted Lenny. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was just that Lenny seemed too hapless to be lying. Either way, Calvin didn't have much choice. Hours passed as they drove, the van rattling over uneven roads and gravel. The desert stretched out endlessly around them, a barren expanse under a sky littered with stars. Calvin's hands stayed steady on the wheel, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. He knew they wouldn't give up. Forge was just the beginning. That he wasn't wrong. When the attack came, it was sudden and brutal. One moment, the van was rolling along the cracked highway, and the next, the night was alive with the deafening whir of helicopter blades. A spotlight flared to life, illuminating the van like a stage performer caught mid-act. Calvin's instinct screamed, and he slammed the brakes just as a missile streaked from the darkness and exploded on the road ahead. The blast sent the van skidding sideways, and Calvin fought to keep it from flipping. Gravel sprayed as they came to a screeching halt, the air thick with dust and the acrid smell of burning rubber. "Out!" Calvin shouted, wrenching the door open. He yanked Lenny from his seat and shoved him toward the cover of a nearby rock formation. The helicopter circled overhead, its spotlight sweeping the ground like an accusatory finger. "Calvin Voss," a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "You are ordered to surrender. Resistance is futile." Calvin squinted up at the helicopter. He didn't recognize the voice, but it didn't matter. He could already feel the telltale hum in the air, the tingling sensation that meant another experiment was near. A figure dropped from the helicopter, landing with unnatural grace on the desert floor. She was slender, her movements fluid and deliberate. Her name flashed in Calvin's mind like a warning. Spectre. She melted into the shadows almost immediately, her form shimmering and vanishing from view. Calvin tensed, his senses straining to track her, but she was too fast, too precise. He felt a rush of air behind him and spun just in time to block a blade aimed at his neck. Spectre materialized in front of him, her face half hidden behind a sleek mask. You've been a thorn in our side for too long, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. Calvin didn't respond. There was no point in arguing. He ducked as she lashed out again, her movements impossibly quick. His own reflexes were sharper than they had ever been, but Spectre was on another level. She was a ghost, striking from angles he couldn't predict. Lenny's voice came from behind the rocks, panicked and high-pitched. Hey, do you want me to? Never mind, I'll stay out of the way. Calvin gritted his teeth, focusing on the fight. Spectre's blade slashed through the air, but he managed to catch her wrist and twist it, forcing her to drop the weapon. She snarled and disappeared again, her form blending seamlessly with the darkness. Calvin closed his eyes, tuning out the chaos around him. He couldn't see her, but he could feel her, the faint disturbance in the air as she moved. When she struck again, he was ready. He sidestepped her attack and slammed his elbow into her ribs, sending her sprawling. The helicopter's spotlight swung toward them, and Calvin used the distraction to grab Lenny. Run, he barked, dragging the janitor toward the jagged rocks in the distance. The helicopter's blades roared above them, and Calvin knew it was only a matter of time before Spectre recovered. They reached the rocks and scrambled over them, the harsh terrain cutting into Calvin's bare feet. Behind them, the helicopter's searchlight swept the ground, hunting. Calvin's chest heaved as he ducked into a crevice, pulling Lenny with him. Great plan, Lenny muttered, his voice shaking. Really top-notch. Calvin ignored him, his mind racing. Spectre was still out there, and the helicopter wasn't leaving until they were either captured or dead. He clenched his fists, feeling the strange energy stir within him again. It wasn't enough to adapt. This time, he'd have to evolve. The faint hum in the air told him Spectre was closing in. Calvin's vision sharpened, his senses heightening as his body prepared for the next fight. He could feel the change coming, the alien power inside him taking over. This time, he wouldn't run. The hum grew louder in Calvin's ears, a low vibration that buzzed through his skull like an electric charge. Spectre was near, he could feel her, even if his eyes couldn't see her. His body tensed, his muscles coiled like springs. He didn't need sight anymore. His evolution had unlocked something deeper, something primal. He could sense the faint disturbances in the air, the tiny shifts in pressure that told him where she was moving. When she struck, he was ready. Spectre's blade came from the shadows, aimed straight for his chest, but Calvin twisted out of the way and grabbed her arm mid-swing. Her invisibility shimmered and failed, and her mask twisted into a snarl of frustration. Or learning, she hissed, yanking her arm back and sliding effortlessly into a defensive stance. Fast learner, Calvin said, his voice sharp. He moved toward her, his steps deliberate, his body already anticipating her next strike. She came at him again, her movements a blur of precision and grace. Her blade sliced through the air, but Calvin ducked, feeling the rush of wind as it missed him by inches. He countered with a quick jab to her midsection, sending her stumbling back. The fight was a dance, brutal and fluid, neither gaining the upper hand for long. Spectre was faster, but Calvin was stronger, and his reflexes were catching up to hers. From behind the rocks, Lenny's panicked voice called out, not to interrupt your superhuman brawl, but we still have a helicopter trying to kill us." Calvin didn't reply. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Spectre feinted left, then spun and aimed a kick at his head. He blocked it with his forearm, the impact reverberating through his bones, and lashed out with a punch that grazed her shoulder. She vanished again, her form dissolving into the shadows, but Calvin didn't panic. He closed his eyes, tuning into the vibrations around him. There. A faint shift in the air to his right. He pivoted and struck out, his hand closing around her wrist as she reappeared, mid-attack. With a twist, he wrenched the blade from her grasp and tossed it aside. Spectre growled and swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. She pinned him with surprising strength, her knee digging into his chest. "You can't win," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You're not built to survive on your own." Calvin gritted his teeth, his body surging with energy. "Watch me." He shoved her off with a burst of strength and leapt to his feet. Spectre lunged for him, but Calvin grabbed her arm and slammed her into the ground. This time, she didn't get back up. She lay there, breathing heavily, her mask cracked and her movements sluggish. The hum of the helicopter blades reminded him that the fight wasn't over. The spotlight swung toward him, and Calvin shielded his eyes as the beam illuminated his sweat-slicked face. Calvin Voss, the voice from the helicopter boomed again. Surrender now, or we will open fire. Calvin's pulse raced. He could see the mounted guns on the helicopter's side, trained on him and ready to fire. He glanced at Lenny, who was crouched behind a boulder, wide-eyed and clutching his injured ribs. There was no way they'd make it out alive if those guns started blazing. Then Calvin felt it, the energy inside him shifting, growing. His body was changing again, adapting to the threat. A strange sensation prickled along his skin, and he realized he could feel the electromagnetic fields surrounding the helicopter. It was faint but distinct, like a pulsing current in the air. He didn't think. He just acted. Calvin raised his hands, focusing on the field. The energy inside him surged, crackling like static electricity, and he directed it outward. The air shimmered as a pulse of raw power shot from his body and struck the helicopter. The machine shuddered violently, its blades faltering as the electronics shorted out. Sparks flew, and the spotlight flickered before going dark. The helicopter tilted, its engine sputtering, and Calvin watched as it spiraled out of control. It crashed 100 yards away in an explosion of fire and smoke, the impact shaking the ground beneath his feet. Lenny poked his head out from behind the rock, his mouth hanging open. Did you fry a helicopter with your brain? Calvin didn't answer. His chest heaved as he stared at the burning wreckage, his body still thrumming with residual energy. He hadn't known he could do that. The power had come from nowhere, raw and uncontrollable, but it had saved their lives. Spectre groaned from where she lay on the ground, and Calvin turned toward her. She wasn't getting up this time. Her mask was shattered, revealing sharp, angular features and cold, piercing eyes. She glared at him, defiant even in defeat. You think this is over? She spat, her voice ragged. They'll never stop hunting you. You're too valuable. Calvin stepped closer, his gaze steady. Then I'll keep running. And if they come after me again, I'll be ready. Spectre's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. Calvin turned away from her and grabbed Lenny by the arm, hauling him to his feet. Let's go. Lenny stumbled after him, still gaping at the smoldering wreckage. You really are something else, you know that? Like, I knew you were freaky strong, but, man, frying a helicopter? That's next level. Calvin didn't respond. His mind was racing, grappling with the implications of what he'd just done. His evolution was accelerating, taking him into uncharted territory. Each new ability felt more alien than the last, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control. They found another road and started walking, the desert stretching out endlessly around them. The stars overhead were cold and indifferent, offering no comfort. Calvin's body ached, his muscles sore from the fight, but he kept moving. He couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. As they walked, Lenny broke the silence. So, what's the next move? You still want to find Dr. Gray? Yes, Calvin said firmly. She's the only one who might have answers. I need to know what's happening to me, and how to stop it. Lenny nodded, though he didn't look convinced. Well, like I said, I've got contacts. Shady types, but they know things. I'll put out some feelers, see if anyone's heard from her. Calvin glanced at him, his expression wary. You sure you're up for this? You don't owe me anything. Lenny gave him a lopsided grin. Are you kidding? This is the most exciting thing that's ever happened to me. Besides, you saved my ass back there. I figure I owe you at least one. Calvin shook his head but didn't argue. They walked in silence for a while, the desert wind biting at their skin. Calvin's thoughts churned, a mix of fear and determination. The fight with Spectre had been a wake-up call. He couldn't keep running forever. The military wasn't just trying to capture him, they were willing to destroy anyone and anything that got in their way. If he didn't find Dr. Gray soon, he might lose the last shreds of humanity he had left.